It's a great pleasure to introduce Daniel Robbins, who's the curator of Leighton House Museum and has been for a number of years. My connection with Leighton House goes back to the dawn of time. I wrote a book with my wife, Leonie, in 1975 when Leighton was not as well known and admired as he is today. And I was the chairman of the Friends for far too long. Connection. Anyway, it's a great pleasure as I say, to introduce Daniel, who's done wonderful things at Leighton House, all manner of exhibitions, displays, and also bringing in the community, educational activities, events of all kinds, and it all culminated in the restoration of the house. So I do urge all of you to go and see Leighton House, because it's really in wonderful condition, with all sorts of new gallery spaces, a wonderful cafe overlooking the garden, highly to be recommended. Anyway, today Daniel isn't talking about the house per se, but about Leighton's most famous painting, Flaming June, which comes from the Ponce Art Gallery in Puerto Rico, thanks to Governor Frederic, who was a formidable character. Anyway, it's currently on show at the Royal Academy, so do go and see it. There's a little display of the color sketch and some of the related drawings, which you'll see in the lecture at Leighton House at this minute. And we couldn't have a better guide and interpreter of Flaming June than Daniel. Over to you.
Thank you, Richard. It's always true to say that the bar is slightly raised when Richard and Leonie are in the audience and I'm talking about, has to be raised when I'm talking about Leighton. But thank you very much for that introduction. Here is Flaming June, as Richard says, currently on display at the Royal Academy, a picture that by far and away is Leighton's most famous work and which has really eclipsed Leighton's fame, the maker of the picture's fame and itself. It stands sort of almost apart from him and is, by account, one of the most reproduced images in the whole of 19th century art. And so through this talk, I would introduce how that fame has arisen, but also go back to its very origins and the making of the picture at a particular point in Leighton's career, right at the end of his career, in fact. Its fame has grown over recent years because the museum in Puerto Rico has been very willing to share it and to tour it. So it was shown on the continent at the Prado, the Belvedere in Vienna, in The Hague, in the Netherlands, and then more recently at the Frick in New York in 2015, as you can see at the top left there. Then at Leighton House in 2016, at the Metropolitan in New York last year, and then coming on to the Royal Academy this year. And us having it at Leighton House gave us first-hand witness to the extraordinary meaning of this picture to so many people, that literally people came from across the country to see it. We were contacted by somebody in South Africa who had been given by a departed loved one a CD of songs, of music, with Flaming June on the cover. And they got in touch to say they were going to come from South Africa and could they have half an hour in the gallery before we opened to the public so they could have a sort of moment with the picture. And so people's association with it, whether it was they had a poster of it on their room as a student or their grandparents' house, there were so many people for whom it clearly had a very powerful meaning and associations. The Royal Academy last week, in a timely way, promoted the fact that they have Flaming June with them. And these images perhaps give a sense in which the picture has transgressed into areas you wouldn't necessarily have thought it would. The cover of Vogue, curled up with a cat, in every antique shop, tattooed on an arm, at the Met Gala, doing her shopping at Sainsbury's, stained glass, and then at the Royal Academy until 2025. And if you should choose to, if you look on the internet, you'll find many of these of people doing their own versions of Flaming June. Some, it has to be said, more satisfactory than others. So really, why is it that this picture should have got to this point and to have become of Leighton's background and who he was, and then where this picture came in his career? So here, if you like, you see the 4 ages of Leighton. From the left-hand side, a teenage self-portrait where he's perhaps a little bit too obviously looking at his reflection in a mirror as he makes that painting. He had been born in 1830 in Scarborough, but at the age of about 11, the family spent increasing amounts of time on the continent, and really all of Leighton's training as an artist was on the continent. So the second image along is him as an art student in Frankfurt, where his family had settled, very conspicuously with his palette to the fore, and showing his skills in rendering that sleeve as it comes out of the picture towards us. Next along is not a self-portrait, but is a portrait of Leighton by his great friend and neighbour G.F. Watts, painted in 1871, so he's 40, just over 40 years old, and a much more informal, relaxed image than many of the photographs and portraits that appeared of Leighton, of which the next one along is really the apogee of Leighton as the grand artistic figure. So commissioned by the Uffizi in 1882 to submit a self-portrait, a great honour to be asked to do that. So Leighton represents himself against the backdrop of a section of the Parthenon frieze, just to sort of anchor the idea of his work being rooted in the classical past, wearing his academic honorary degree robes awarded by Oxford University, and his chain of office as the president of the Royal Academy, which he became in 1878, also on view. And Leighton went on to be ennobled. He remains the only British artist to have received that honour. He's actually also one of the shortest lived peers of the realm, in that he never actually made it to the House of Lords to formally be ennobled. And the press speculated after his death as to whether or not he should be referred to as Lord Leighton. And then Queen Victoria issued a statement saying, in her opinion, he ought to be, so that counted for something. But in effect, he was almost not, in his lifetime, not referred to as Lord Leighton. It was so much at the tail end, right at the death. In tandem with that life was the development of his studio house. So it started in the mid-1860s on the left, and relatively modestly, but over the 30 years that Leighton lived here, there was almost no period of any length of time when he wasn't adding to it or embellishing it in one way or another. So it ended up being described as a private palace of art, not just because of the extraordinary environment of the house itself, but it was absolutely crammed with the collections that he had assembled of fine and decorative art over the course of his career. He was the son of a doctor, so here you see him with his 2 sisters, Alexandra and Augusta, and his parents. His grandfather had emigrated to St. Petersburg and became the private physician to the Russian royal family, and effectively made the family's fortune. So the father, although himself qualified as a doctor, didn't really need to practice, and for the sake of his mother's health, and I think for the enrichment of his children, of whom he had certainly high expectations, he took them to live on the continent, as I said, and so Leighton had this extraordinary cosmopolitan upbringing. And we have in the museum some of Augusta's diaries when the family have returned to live in Bath, in which Leighton clearly comes across as being the sort of golden boy of the family. He's already, his potential and capacities are very obvious to many. And they were manifested in his first exhibition picture at the Royal Academy in 1855, where this is an oil sketch for that composition. So he'd left Frankfurt, went to Rome with the intention of painting the pictures which would launch his career, where you might think the sensible thing to do would be to paint something relatively modest just to kind of get the ball rolling. He embarked on this great long processional picture, made these beautiful studies of virtually every head in that procession, and and hands. It's about 18 feet long, and he couldn't decide whether to send it for exhibition in Paris or to London to the Royal Academy. The idea the Royal Academy would give over 18 feet of wall space to a complete unknown artist, again, might seem a sort of long shot, but it was not only selected, it was hung in, very well in the exhibition, and then Prince Albert, on the preview day, persuaded Queen Victoria she should buy it. So it was this extraordinary debut where really from nowhere, he was seen as the great hope for British art, and it actually cast a very long shadow over the rest of his career. Reference was always made back to this picture and to the impact that it had had. It remains in the Royal Collection, but has been on long-term loan to the National Gallery, where you can see it. For a period afterwards, there was definitely some kind of backlash. So it took a number of years, the best part of a decade really, for Leighton to regain the momentum in his career and his election as associate of the Royal Academy in 1864. But these images give a sense of the work that he was producing. In the center, one of a set of pictures that he made of a famous model, Nana Risi, in Rome, which were very much within the aesthetic movement, or Leighton's part in the formation of that is increasingly become apparent. And also at bottom right, which we'll talk a little bit more about, he made throughout his career landscape sketches, and at Leighton House this autumn we're organising the first exhibition devoted to that aspect of his career. But as you can see, his sort of extraordinary technical accomplishment and the high level of finish, the great consistency which existed over the 40 years of his career in the production of his pictures, punctuated as it was by these grand processional paintings. This one painted in 1866, the Cimabue picture was exhibited in 1855. I always wonder whether the fact he was building his house at the time that he painted this is not a coincidence, that he needed to raise some money so a big picture might facilitate that. But these multi-figural compositions, complex compositions, became, if you like, a trademark of his career, punctuating it as it progressed. So the painting of Flaming June comes right at the very end of a 40-year career of painting. It wasn't sort of on the way, it was absolutely, literally at the death. So this is a photograph of Leighton's studio in the spring of 1895 with the pictures that he's about to send to the Royal Academy for which was to turn out to be his last submission to the Royal Academy, lined up on easels. And this is to mark what was called Show Sunday. So it was the weekend before the pictures were sent to the Royal Academy, where there was not just Leighton, but his neighbours and artists opened their studios so that the pictures could be seen for the first time. It was effectively a launch event where the press were involved. Members of the royal family wouldn't join the rest, but would come the day before and have a private preview of the pictures. And it all helped create a sense of anticipation of the works that were about to appear. So accounts of these events are of hundreds of people passing through the studio, enjoying the opportunity to nose around the studio, meet the artist, see the pictures, and be part of this moment in the calendar. A report of 1882 in the newspaper says that a number of the artists were becoming less enthusiastic about participating in Show Sunday because at the end of the day, they realized some of their precious ornaments were no longer present and people had been helping themselves to souvenirs. So here you can see on the right, Flaming June, and the other pictures, these artists sent pictures which varied from what were called, and Leighton himself used the term pot boilers, so simple pictures that could be relatively rapidly produced, which they thought would find a ready market, as well as more complex pictures. Here, the thing that unites these, as you can see, is they're all single female compositions. There are no more complex compositions than that, which was unusual, and it was unusual also that Leighton sent this number of pictures at this point in his career. particularly so because the creation of Flaming June coincides with the faltering of his health, with the heart condition, with angina that would ultimately lead to his death the following year. And so in October of 1894, when he was in the midst of working on Flaming June, he was walking to the Athenaeum from St. James's and had this first agonizing attack. And you can see from this photograph of this period in his life where his health clearly, he doesn't look in great shape. But it was a slightly mysterious condition to the extent that, as he said himself, between attacks, he was able to function completely normally, and in fact felt he never had more, something like he never had more appetite for working than he did in the period from when this condition began to manifest itself. The other thing that was going on in the background as he was painting Flaming June was he was rebuilding a part of his house. So, as I said, Leighton's work on his house had been a kind of pretty much constant preoccupation over a very extended period of time. And the very last bit of it was the creation of the picture on the right, the silk room on the first floor of the house, built as a picture gallery in which to display primarily works that he'd been given by his friends and contemporaries. So on the left is that space before work began, and it's this wall on the left that he knocked through, replacing it with these columns to create that space. So this is all going on, again, exactly at the point that he is working on Flaming June. One of the things that absolutely defined Leighton as an artist was his method, was the process involved in making pictures. He himself used the word scientific to describe how he went about doing this, and was very willing in a number of interviews to describe in great detail, because he clearly thought it was important. So he felt he needed or wanted to share that, in effect, there was no shortcutting with this method. Even at the end of his life, when he'd been working as an artist for 40 years, he adhered pretty much to the same method he'd established right at the beginning. And what that involved, as he described it, was that an idea for a picture would come fully formed into his mind's eye. He would then make a thumbnail little sketch which would capture the critical information that would be required to make that painting. And here you can see those little thumbnail sketches and the resultant picture, and you can see straight away how accurate and how the finished picture is encapsulated and captured in this little sketch. But it didn't mean that he would necessarily then immediately embark on painting that picture, that these sketches and little thumbnail ideas could be parked in his drawings for a number of certainly months, years on occasions. And the drawings that he made, of which we have 500 sheets of these drawings at the museum, became a kind of constant place where he could refer to look for ideas, and out of these drawings generate further ideas for his paintings. And so here you then see how he would progress to making nude studies of the figures in the composition, separate studies which were really all about the draperies that were involved, further drawing here of the curtain at the back, then the color sketch. So this was a very rapidly produced small little color sketch that was specifically about determining how color would be arranged across the composition. And then he would embark on the finished picture itself, and said that when it came to painting the finished picture, he actually could progress that very quickly because all of the thinking had been done and all of the working out of that picture was contained within the drawings and the color sketch. And I think it's not much of an exaggeration to say that if you gave Leighton a blank canvas and some brushes and just said, could you paint me a picture, please? He sort of almost psychologically couldn't do that it had to be part of this careful considered progress of making a picture from its first imagining through to its realization at the end of the process. And another example here of painting Daedalus and Icarus, showing the drawings at the top left, the color sketch, and then the finished work. And as I say, this is pretty much consistently and constantly adhered to all the way through his working life. So with Flaming June, what's so interesting about it is that while not entirely a different process, there is some suggestion with it, more of, not quite the accidental, but more of it evolving and picking up ideas that he had already expressed in other pictures and developing and evolving them further. So going right back to 1872 with this picture, which is, I mean, effectively lost, is in a collection in India, and reports are that its condition is very deteriorated. But this is Summer Moon, where again you have a parapet, you have these slumbering female figures with some suggestion or beginning of suggestion of the pose that reappears with Flaming June over 20 years later. There are also drawings in our collection. This is actually in the Ashmolean, but drawings which suggest again the idea of this pose had been around for a very long time. This is on blue paper, and one of the things that Leighton, in his very orderly, systematic way, did was to change the color of the paper on which he made studies at effectively 3 intervals, and seems to then have adhered very strictly to using the new paper. So he changed from blue paper to a brown paper at the end of the 1870s, 1879, 1880. So this is on blue paper, which, unless it's just an odd exception, suggests it might have been made way back in the 1870s, where again you can see variations, and this is so expressive of how drawing for Leighton was a means of exploring and developing the pose that he was considering. So again, the suggestion that the idea of this picture hadn't come, as it were, fully formed, but was a kind of process of evolution. There's a close overlap with the picture on the left, the Garden of the Hesperides, where there are drawings, as you see on the right, for that central figure, which again suggest particularly in those lower 2 drawings, ideas very similar to the pose of Flaming June, with the limbs, the leg tucked behind the other leg, the very prominent, long, extended or exaggerated almost thigh, and then the 2 options, the upper figure with the more expressive open gesture, the lower 2. And of course, it's possible that Leighton made not all of these 3 drawings all at the same time, that, as I say, he referred back to or revisited an idea, and from it began to develop a second idea. But clearly there is a linkage and an overlap to Flaming June. Similarly, here in 1894, a picture called Summer Slumber, with, as you can see, again, a sleeping female figure on the parapet, on the edge of this pool. But if you look at the relief carvings, which are suggested at lower left and lower right, you can see here already what is effectively the resolved pose for Flaming June as a relief carving, expressed as a relief carving. And again, given Leighton's sort of lack of spontaneity, I think this wouldn't have just been something he just put on there. It would have already been clearly in development and being progressed through his drawings. So all of this suggests that there was, as I say, this idea of this painting linked to other pictures in his mind over an extended period of time. Where that came from, as has often been pointed out, the most obvious source is Night from the Medici chapel, seen here at the top left, with, again, that the thigh very prominently shown, and the curve of the figure echoed again in the destroyed Leader and the Swan, here known as in a version that's in the National Gallery, again by Michelangelo. And so Leighton absolutely, I don't know if the words identified himself with Michelangelo, but clearly Michelangelo was a very significant figure and idea of what an artist should be for Leighton, even to the extent that as you climbed the stairs up to his studio, you passed this, which was in a frame cemented into the wall, so it was always there and intended for that spot, not by Leighton, but acquired by him. So as you approached his own studio, you were perhaps given an idea of the sort of kind of art you should perhaps be modestly be thinking of. And then within the studio itself, there are other interesting little clues or connections to Flaming June. So on the picture on the left, you can see the great north-facing studio window, and at the base of which here were photographs of the sculpture from the Medici chapel. So night was amongst those. It's also been pointed out that if you think of this north window with its platform and line of the window, that it actually lines up with the parapet of Flaming June, this strong horizontal line, and then daylight or the space beyond opening up above it. Although I think theoretically where models could pose standing on this platform, there's no visual representation of that ever happening. The model seems to have posed within the body of the room itself. But again, it's an interesting connection to the environment in which Leighton was working. And equally, as has been cited, the Michelangelo's Tondo, the today Tondo in the Royal Academy collections, which again Leighton would be very familiar with, and he had a cast of it immediately above the door to his studio on the opposite side of the room to that bay, to the big north-facing window. So that again was an image with the figure, that circular form of the composition being something that he was very familiar with and may have been in some degree in his mind influencing his thought as he developed the Flaming June composition. The other source, this is a slightly blurry side, and this is part of what we're exploring in the landscapes exhibition, is that Leighton traveled very extensively. So effectively every year in the early autumn, so the end of August, early September, he would set off on what were usually a number of weeks of travel before coming back to the studio to complete the works for the next Royal Academy submission. And as he traveled, he made sketches which were not for exhibition and not for sale, but were brought back by him and were hung in his own studio. At the time of his death, or after his death when everything was sold, about 200 examples of these landscape sketches were sold. And they served, or seemed to have served, a similar sort of function to the drawings, in that he was compiling a whole set of references. Sometimes he traveled because he had in mind a particular landscape he knew, and he wanted to paint it because he knew it was relevant to a picture that he was working on. But more often than not, he was producing these partly for his own interests and enjoyment and relaxation, but partly he described them as little notes of truth that would be useful to him when he was working on his pictures in the studio itself. And this is an example of that, this iridescent reflection of the light on the sea. And when we come to see Flaming June again, you'll see that same quite thickly painted suggestion of the almost metallic effect of the sun's light on the water behind. This was a sketch he made on the island of Rhodes. So this is a set of thumbnails. Again, whether these were all made on the same day, which would, if you like, constitute a kind of good day at the office, if he suddenly came up with a whole set of ideas for pictures, But if there is a thumbnail for Flaming June, it's perhaps this. It's not as immediately readable, but there is a curled figure. You can see the extended thigh here. You can see the strong horizontal line behind them. But it's not as clear-cut and categoric as other examples. Again, as I say, suggesting the idea it was more of an evolution than a kind of immediate spark. And then there are a whole set of drawings relating to the development of the composition itself. Leighton said that the idea for this pose came to him when a model, weary at the end of a day of posing, herself adopted this attitude and pose, which there is a sense of in this more kind of immediate, quickly drawn sketch of a figure, the female figure in an armchair, and it looks almost more comfortable than many of the versions of the same pose that developed. He then, as he did, made separate nude studies of the figure. Again, just slight variations in the positioning of the arm, the extent to which the arm runs across the body and is tucked in, supporting the head. On the left, these are not directly Flaming June related, but it's the same sort of ideas. And in fact, this, if you look at that pose, and then we just go back to, it's more actually like that, with the two legs drawn up together. Again, versions on that same armchair, which may or may not directly relate, or may just have been exercises in themselves. Again, on the left, something that's now approaching closer to the finished pose, particularly in the lower drawing. The upper one, again, with that arm outstretched, which exaggerates or emphasizes the kind of circular idea of the composition, but it isn't as pleasing as the lower one. I think I showed that already, but again, on the right, an untraced drawing that, again, is getting much closer to and much more developed in its understanding of the pose and how it would work, although still variations where the figure is more opened and turned away. And again, this, with the figure turned and the head facing outwards as opposed to being tucked into this pose. So Leighton is exhaustively really looking for the combination of these elements, of this figure, of this pose, that for him is most satisfying. And he was prepared to exhaustively work in this way in order to achieve what he's looking for. So on the right, a drawing that surfaced only relatively recently of the actual head of the figure herself. So then from that stage, Leighton would move to squaring up the composition. He would make a drawing of the finished composition, which I think is next. So this is, in our collection, is the finished drawing, which he is ready to then progress to transferring to the canvas. And you can see here, when it's abstracted from any kind of setting, how circular that is, how sun-like it is in the way he's rendered it. And interestingly, these are at the Royal Academy, where normally he would produce one of these squared up drawings. He's made two, because as you can see, he's deciding how close to the front plane of the picture the figure will be, or how set back. So as you can see on the right, it's much closer to us than on the left, and also how much of the surrounding context will be contained within the composition. And then from there, he moved to the color sketch. And as Richard said, this is now, as of last year, in the collections of Leighton House. So David Veary, who's been the chair of Leighton House and a great supporter of the refurbishment project that we've completed, without telling anyone, I think including his wife, decided that this was on the market and that he wished to acquire it to mark the completion of the refurbishment of Leighton House, and to bring up the representation of this painting into the museum's collections. But it's also, and this just to show you the change in scale, it's actually this big compared to this, because this was absolutely essentially a working little sketch where Leighton would, but anyone who has seen it, it still though carries a surprising punch given its diminutive scale. And so here you see it next to the finished composition, and you can see there are two differences, which again is unusual for Leighton to, at this advanced stage in developing the picture, to have tweaked it effectively. So as you can see in the color sketch, the awning above is this irregular shape suggesting perhaps a breeze moving that awning, and then again on the distant horizon, an island. So both of these, the painting, true to Leighton's way of working, was painted with both these elements present in it and was then over-painted. He corrected it to establish obviously this relationship between the top of the parapet, the seat on which he's sitting, and then the edge of the awning at the top. So what's so interesting or useful in having the color sketch is it is really the only documentation there is of his first idea of what he was going to paint, only then changed right at the end. And so here you can see the exhibition we did in 2016, which was bringing Flaming June back to reunite it with the pictures which accompanied it when it was first exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1895. And in looking at the critical response to its first exhibition, there's no sense, well, you're much more aware of the idea of continuity. I mean, Leighton had been exhibiting at the Royal Academy for many, many years, and the critics' sort of reaction was, well, here's another set of Leighton's pictures. They probably, the majority, identify Flaming June as the most impactful of them, and the colour being what is seized on. But there are admirers of all the other pictures, were picked out by different critics as being the one they thought was most significant, including the listener, this little almost sort of throwaway picture that he had produced. And that sort of got coverage at the expense of Flaming June. There was no sense anywhere, and perhaps it'd be, no one was aware this was going to be his last submission. They were just thinking, here's his latest submission. No one was thinking, here now is the picture which in 100 years will have taken on, or 100 plus years will have taken on this life of its own. There was no suggestion of that. But the reality was that Leighton wasn't around anyway. He wasn't there at the Royal Academy when it was unveiled. He wasn't there to necessarily read the critiques that talked about it, because by this point, this heart condition that he'd had become public. And so on the advice of his doctors, in March of 1895, he went abroad for the sake of his health, which meant that he missed, and he'd become absolutely a fixture and relied on to host and deliver the Royal Academy events, the banquet, the events around the summer exhibition. The painter John Everett Millais was installed to take his place, and spoke about his absence at the banquet. And it was then commented on that Millais invited, I think, the Archbishop of York to speak when he should have been inviting the Archbishop of somewhere else. And there was a few comments of this would never have happened if Leighton had still. So Leighton went off to North Africa, which had been his first trip outside of mainland Europe, had been to Algeria in 1857. He went first to Tangier, and then, I mean, and this is all supposed to be relaxing and regaining his health, travelled across into Algeria to Algiers, and then this extraordinary way made a 500-mile round trip to the town of Biskra on the edge of the Sahara, where he made this painting. But he did, as he returned to France and then London, he did write about how, for him, there was nothing more relaxing than he could do than to make these little landscape sketches, that they had taken on a kind of a significance for him, which was about escaping from his all of that kind of Royal Academy stuff and returning to the simple act of painting, depicting a scene in paint on, by this point, on a little wooden panel. And that clearly had become very significant to him. But again, it's ironic that when Flaming June was first launched on the public, Leighton was nowhere to be seen, and in these remote locations in North Africa. But its fame had initially, after his death, began to spread through the graphic, as you can see here, this which acquired the picture. The proprietor of the graphic purchased Flaming June, and perhaps himself, as he was an engraver, I mean, was conscious of its reproduction, of how well it might reproduce. And so they made this offer of a presentation plate of Flaming June, rather misleadingly described as the last finished picture, which it wasn't his last finished picture. And in fact, the graphic also slightly implied that he painted it for the graphic so that they could then make the reproduction of it. And we then enter the sort of afterlife of the picture. So it has this prominence following Leighton's death. It's then bought by the Watney family, the brewing family. It remains with them till in 1915, it's lent to the Ashmolean in Oxford. It remains at the Ashmolean in Oxford till about 1931. It was exhibited in the Leighton Memorial Exhibition in 1930 at Leighton House, but from effectively 1931 until its reappearance in 1962, its whereabouts are completely lost. It disappears from sight, and how it re-emerges has become part of its legend. The story is that in 1962, behind some panelling above the fireplace, found Flaming June. So carried it to the local framing shop, run by somebody called Ingo Fink, who sort of looked at it. It then was bought by a hairdresser. It all sounds less and less plausible, who had a barber's in Albemarle Street, which was frequented by art dealers. It was bought by somebody called Colonel Beddington, who was an art dealer, and then he sold it to Jeremy Mars. And Jeremy Mars was one of the earliest dealers to begin to reawaken an interest in Victorian pictures. At somewhere in that transition, it lost its original frame, and it was in Jeremy Mars's shop when this person, Louis Ferre, the governor of Puerto Rico, who Richard met and Leonie have met and referred to, he was in London and traveling on the continent as well to acquire pictures with the idea that he was for a foundation he'd established in order to establish a museum in his hometown of Ponce in the south of the island of Puerto Rico. He commissioned the architect Edward Dorrell Stone, as you can see, to design a beautiful modernist building. And after a little bit of wavering, having seen Flaming June, he went to Paris, thought about it, came back and acquired it for £2,000 and took it to Puerto Rico, which has remained its home ever since. The reason it's been touring so much is Puerto Rico, as you know, was hit both by a hurricane and by an earthquake, which has undermined the foundations of this building. And so it can't, at the moment, be open to the public. And so I think touring the picture is a way of trying to raise awareness and interest in the plight or the challenges that they have in Puerto Rico to get the building, which is an enormous cost, to rebuild the foundations and get it reopened again. The other person who features in this story and has become part of the sort of urban myth around the painting is Andrew Lloyd Webber, of course, the great collector of pre-Raphaelite and Victorian art. And for many years, there was, he had the story that as a young man, he had seen it in a shop window, and whatever it cost, £50, he only had £45 or something like that. So he went and asked his elderly aunt if she would lend him the £5, and she said something like, well, I'm not having that sort of rubbish, and wouldn't give it to him. And so he missed his chance. And when we were fundraising for the Leighton House project, we had a dinner, and Andrew Lloyd Webber came to that dinner, and it was when Flaming June was upstairs in the gallery. So as the guests were going upstairs, I said to him, could you tell everyone the story of how you nearly bought it? And he said, well, the thing is, I realized it's not true. He was working on his autobiography and had sort of pieced together the timeline, and it had already gone to Puerto Rico, I think, was when he thought he'd seen it. So, but it doesn't stop it still being repeated as fact. So that has also fed into the legend of the picture, and there you see it in its home in Puerto Rico, in the magnificent frame that was recreated by Wiggins in London for the exhibition at the Royal Academy, the 1996 centenary exhibition, which Richard and Leonie were instrumental in making happen. And so that replaced the very throwaway frame that had been put round it following the loss of the original frame, and of course is hugely important in the impact of the picture. Then to finish, something that's occurred to me recently is that Leighton, towards the end of his life, and so on the left, the return of Persephone, of this figure rising up to daylight, to sunlight, a first version of Clytie in the centre here, in the sorry, that's his Leeds art gallery, it's at the Fitzwilliam, which is of the figure of Clytie here. This is Apollo, the sun disappearing over the line of the hill. She falls to her knees, imploring Apollo to return, and he takes pity on her and turns her into a flower, commonly assumed to be the sunflower, so a sunflower constantly following the path of the sun across the sky. So again, the idea of sunlight is key there. And then the last picture that Leighton was working on, so he finished his Flaming June submission and did start on the next set of paintings, despite his faltering health. And so Clytie, which is now in the Leighton House collections, was unfinished at the time of his death the following January. But again, it's got it was seen and was seized on as being this appropriate image as his last painting. Again, it was only his last painting because he happened to die. It wasn't he was certainly thinking about further works even beyond it. But it was seized on as being somehow so appropriate because of the sense of awareness, as it was interpreted, of his failing health, of life waning, of light departing. So it's maybe a bit trite to say it, but he had just built, at the end of the 1880s, he had built a new studio on the side of his house called the Winter Studio, because all these artists struggle over the winter because of the poor conditions of light. So the winter absence of sunlight compounded by smog, being able to work this much lighter. And so I wonder whether this theme of being interested in the idea of light and sunlight and daylight has some relationship to this new working environment in which he'd created for himself. And here you see Clytie, that last picture, again with Leighton going through all these stages of making studies. There are as many drawings for this last picture, again, as there are going back, and why this picture has so inspired and captured imagination. And one can say on one level, it's this image of this figure, has what's not like a new. Arguably, his whole career, he was striving, using the simple ideas of design, of colour,